The photograph was dated 1931, its edges soft with age, its surface lightly cracked like dry skin. At first glance it was harmless, almost sweet. A young girl stood in a sunlit yard, her dress pressed and pale, one hand resting on the head of a large black dog, seated obediently beside her. The girl smiled in that stiff, careful way children once did for long exposures, eyes fixed just past the camera, as if concentrating on staying perfectly still. The dog's gaze, however, met the lens directly, calm and alert. People who saw the image often commented on that first, on how loyal the animal looked, how safe the girl must have felt with such a companion at her side. For decades, the photograph lived quietly in an album, passed between hands, admired and forgotten until someone decided to digitize it. The scanner caught more than the human eye ever had. The grain sharpened, the background deepened. The space beneath the dog's belly darkened into something heavier than shadow. It wasn't immediately obvious. Nothing ever is at first. But there was a sense that the image had gained weight, as if the air inside it had thickened. When the zoom increased, the charm began to drain away. The dog's shadow stretched in a direction that defied the sun's position. The girl's fingers, resting in the animal's fur, seemed to sink slightly too deep, as though the texture beneath her hand was not entirely solid. And then there was the shape inside the shadow, curved and deliberate, with a suggestion of form that made the eyes recoil before the mind could explain why. Those who noticed it felt an instinctive need to look away, yet found themselves returning again and again, adjusting contrast, sharpening edges, hoping to disprove what they thought they saw. The photograph did not change. It waited. The longer it was examined, the more it seemed to offer, not answers, but the unbearable feeling that the moment it captured had never truly ended, and that something within it had been aware of the camera all along. The photograph entered the present quietly, without ceremony, discovered during a routine clearing of an old house that had belonged to the family for generations. The house itself stood slightly apart from the others on the street, its bricks darkened by time, its rooms holding the faint, persistent smell of paper and dust. Inside a narrow upstairs closet, behind winter coats no one had worn in years, sat a wooden trunk reinforced with dull metal corners. The lock had long since rusted into uselessness, and when the lid was lifted, it released a breath of stale air, as though it had been holding onto it since another century. Inside were letters tied with twine, brittle newspapers folded with care, and several leather-bound photo albums whose spines cracked softly when touched. One album, smaller than the rest, was wrapped in a piece of yellowing cloth. The fabric had been folded with deliberate care, suggesting it had once been important to someone who wanted to protect what lay inside. When the cloth was removed, the album's cover revealed a simple embossed pattern, no name, no date, only the faint impression of a floral design worn smooth by repeated handling. The pages inside were thick and black, the corners of each photograph held in place by small triangular mounts that had begun to loosen with age. Most of the images were what one would expect from the early decades of the 20th century. Formal portraits of stern men in suits, women seated upright with their hands folded, children posed beside furniture that seemed far too large for them. There were outdoor scenes as well. Picnics frozen into stillness, groups standing in fields or on porches, all of them carrying the unmistakable stiffness of long-exposure photography. Each image felt sealed, complete, its meaning resting safely in the past. Then came the photograph of the girl and her dog. It occupied the center of a page, positioned as though it mattered more than the others around it. The corners holding it were newer, replaced at some point, and the paper beneath showed faint marks, where fingers had pressed again and again. The date had been written in careful ink beneath it, 1931. Nothing else accompanied it. No names. No location. Yet the image itself felt unusually intimate, as if it were not meant for strangers' eyes. At first glance, there was nothing unsettling about it. The girl appeared to be no more than 8 or 9 years old, standing barefoot on what looked like a patch of dry grass. Her dress was light colored, falling just below her knees, its fabric simple but well kept. Her hair had been cut into a neat bob, framing a face that carried a shy, obedient smile. She stood close to the dog, one hand resting gently on its head, her fingers splayed in a way that suggested familiarity and trust rather than posed affection. The dog was large, possibly a shepherd mix, with dark fur that absorbed the light. It sat beside her with its body angled slightly forward, posture alert but relaxed. Its ears were upright, its mouth closed, its expression steady. Unlike the girl, whose eyes drifted just off-center, as if following a photographer's instruction, the dog looked straight into the lens. There was no blur in its gaze, no uncertainty, only a calm, focused attention that made it feel more present than the human figure beside it. The background was unremarkable. A wooden fence ran along the back of the yard, weathered and uneven, with a tree rising behind it, its leaves caught mid-stillness. The light suggested late afternoon, soft but direct, casting mild shadows beneath their feet. Everything about the composition spoke of ordinariness, of a moment captured and preserved without intention of meaning more than memory. Those who first saw the photograph admired it for exactly that reason. It felt warm, almost comforting, a glimpse into a simpler time when dangers seemed distant and companionship was uncomplicated. People remarked on how close the girl stood to the dog, how natural their bond appeared, how the animal's presence seemed to guard her even within the confines of the frame. It was the kind of image that invited nostalgia, the kind that made viewers imagine the sounds. Just beyond the photograph, insects in the grass, a voice calling from the house, the soft thud of a tail against the ground. Because it felt so harmless, no one questioned it. It was passed around the room, commented on briefly, then returned to the album. Its date was noted, its condition admired. It became a point of mild interest rather than focus, another artifact among many, another window into a past that felt safely sealed. The idea that anything within it might demand closer attention never occurred to anyone in that moment. The photograph remained what it had likely always been to those who owned it originally: a keepsake, a token of affection, perhaps even a symbol of protection. It suggested a story of childhood, watched over by something loyal and strong. It carried none of the obvious markers of tragedy or strangeness. There were no blurred faces, no damaged emulsion, no visual distortions to provoke unease. It rested comfortably in the mind as an image of innocence, the kind that reassures rather than disturbs. And that was what made it so easy to overlook, so easy to accept at face value. Because when something appears gentle and familiar, the instinct is to trust it, to believe that what it shows is all there is, and that whatever lies beyond the edges of the frame has already been settled by time. Waiting quietly where it belongs, the decision to digitize the photograph came from practicality rather than curiosity. The albums were old, their bindings fragile, and there was concern that continued handling would damage them beyond repair. A flathead scanner was set up on a desk near a window, its lid carefully lowered over each page, the process methodical and almost reverent. At first, the scans revealed nothing unexpected. The familiar faces emerged on the screen, with sharper lines and clearer contrast. But they remained what they had always been, static remnants of lives long finished. When the photograph of the girl and her dog appeared on the monitor, It carried the same gentle quality it had in print. If anything, the clarity made it more appealing. The textures of the dress became more defined, the strands of hair more distinct, the dog's fur richer and deeper in tone. The scan preserved every scratch and crease, every tiny imperfection etched into the paper by time. It felt complete, honest, faithful to the original. Someone adjusted the resolution slightly higher, more out of habit than intention, and saved the file. Later, while reviewing the images one by one, a pause lingered on this particular photograph. It was not prompted by fear or suspicion, but by a vague sense of imbalance, the sort that arises when something refuses to settle comfortably in the mind. The eye drifted not to the figures themselves, but to the space around them, the negative areas that usually fade into irrelevance. The shadows beneath the dog appeared darker than expected, not dramatically so, but enough to register as heavier, denser. At first, it was attributed to the scanner's lighting, or perhaps the age of the photograph itself. Old prints often carried uneven tones, areas where chemicals had reacted unpredictably. Still, the shadow did not behave like the others. The girl's shadow fell softly to one side, thin and diffuse. The fence behind them cast broken lines on the ground, consistent with the angle of the light. But the shape beneath the dog pooled inward, its edges slightly too deliberate. Curiosity crept in quietly. The image was enlarged, then enlarged again. Pixel stretched, grain grew coarse, but the darkness held its form. It did not dissolve into noise the way shadow normally did under magnification. Instead, it seemed to reveal layers, subtle gradations that suggested depth, rather than flatness. Someone joked that it looked like the dog was sitting on something, and the remark was met with brief laughter before falling into an uneasy silence. Further adjustments were made. Contrast increased, highlights sharpened, shadows isolated. These were standard tools, used countless times before, but their effect here felt strangely invasive, as though the photograph resisted the attention. The darker area beneath the dog began to show a faint curvature, a line that hinted at contour. It was not enough to clearly define a shape, but it was enough to suggest intention. And intention did not belong in a shadow. Attention shifted back to the dog itself. Its posture, once rated as calm and obedient, now appeared subtly tense. The angle of its head seemed slightly off, tilted just enough to be noticeable under scrutiny. Its eyes, fixed on the camera, reflected light differently than expected, catching a pale gleam that made them appear deeper, almost hollow. The longer the image was examined, the more that steady gaze felt less like loyalty and more like awareness. Someone zoomed further, focusing on the girl's hand where it rested in the dog's fur. The fingers disappeared into the darkness of the coat, but not in the soft, natural way fur usually allowed. There was a suggestion of distortion, as though the boundary between skin and hair was blurred, uncertain. It was subtle, easily dismissed as a scanning artifact, yet it lingered in the mind, refusing to be neatly explained. The background, once ignored, began to draw attention. The fence slats showed irregularities that did not align with perspective. One plank appeared, slightly warped in a way that did not match the others, its edge bending inward rather than outward. The tree behind them cast a shadow that seemed to fracture unnaturally as it crossed the ground. Its branches implied, but never fully formed. These details might have gone unnoticed in isolation, but together they created a quiet discord, a sense that the photograph was not entirely faithful to physical rules. As the magnification increased, the image lost its nostalgic softness and gained something sharper, more brittle. The charm that had once defined it began to erode, replaced by a creeping unease that was difficult to articulate. No single element could be pointed to as proof of wrongness. Instead, it was the accumulation of small inconsistencies, each one defensible on its own, that formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Someone suggested comparing it to other photographs from the same album, checking lighting and composition for consistency. Those images behaved as expected under similar adjustments. Their shadows broke apart under zoom, their textures flattened into grain. None of them seemed to conceal anything beyond what they showed. Returning to the image of the girl and her dog after that comparison made it feel isolated, separate, as though it belonged to a different category entirely. The realization settled slowly that the photograph was offering more than it should, that the act of looking closer was not merely revealing detail, but uncovering something that had been waiting beneath the surface. What had once been a simple keepsake now felt layered, almost guarded, as if the image itself had been composed with the knowledge that one day it would be examined beyond its intended limits, and that only then would the irregularity beneath the dog's shadow begin to suggest that the photograph was not simply a record of what stood before the camera, but a container for something that had been present and partially concealed, something that did not fully belong to light, and therefore clung to the darker spaces, becoming clearer only when those spaces were forced into view and held there long enough for the mind to register that the darkness was not empty, but shaped, patient, and disturbingly consistent across every adjustment, every attempt to explain it away, as though it had always expected to be found, and was now allowing itself to be seen just enough to invite the next, more dangerous question as the examination deepened. The process shifted from casual curiosity to something closer to obsession. The photograph was no longer treated as an artifact, but as a problem demanding resolution. Measurements were taken directly from the digital image, angles calculated, light sources inferred and mapped. Based on the position of the sun suggested by the fence and the girl's shadow, the darker mass beneath the dog should have stretched away at a shallow angle, thinning as it went. Instead, it gathered inward, thickening where physics insisted it should fade. This was not a matter of poor exposure or chemical aging. The math refused to cooperate with any ordinary explanation. An anatomically trained eye was brought into the discussion. Someone accustomed to reading form through partial obstruction. They studied the contours that emerged when contrast was pushed to uncomfortable extremes. What appeared was not random. There was a rounded suggestion where no muscle or bone should be visible, a curve that implied structure beneath the darkness. It did not align with the dog's body in any way that made biological sense. If it were part of the animal, it would require joints that did not exist, extensions that contradicted its posture. The shadow was not behaving as an absence of light, but as a presence interrupting it. The shape became more assertive the longer it was scrutinized. It was never fully clear, never generous enough to define itself. Yet it hinted with a confidence that felt deliberate. There was a narrowing near what could only be interpreted as a lower boundary, followed by a subtle widening above it, as though something were crouched or folded inward. Attempts to smooth the image or reduce noise only emphasized the contour. It did not dissolve under correction. It resisted erasure. Attention returned again to the dog's gaze, now impossible to dismiss as merely alert. Its eyes reflected no obvious source of glare, yet they held a depth inconsistent with the flatness of early photography. There was a suggestion of refraction, as though light entering them was bending around something dense. When the image was inverted, the effect intensified rather than vanished. The pupils appeared too dark, too complete, lacking the minor imperfections typical of animal eyes captured on film from that era. They seemed less like eyes responding to light and more like apertures absorbing it. The girl's expression, once read as shy, now felt rigid in a way that exceeded the stiffness of long exposure. Her mouth curved upward, but the muscles around it appeared tense, drawn tight rather than relaxed. Her eyes, slightly unfocused, carried a faint glaze that could not be attributed solely to motion blur. When compared to other children in photographs from the same period, the difference was subtle but undeniable. Those faces, even when still, held micro-variations, tiny signs of restlessness or distraction. Hers did not. She looked fixed, as though her role in the image had been set and could not be adjusted. A lighting specialist examined the image next, isolating the wavelengths reflected by different areas. The results only deepened the unease. The darker region beneath the dog absorbed light differently than the surrounding shadows. Its tonal response was inconsistent with shaded ground or fur. It behaved more like a surface that was not meant to be illuminated, one that reacted to exposure by compressing rather than revealing detail. Increasing brightness did not clarify it. It simply became flatter, more opaque, as if light were being consumed rather than reflected. The error itself became part of the question. In 1931, photographic manipulation was limited, laborious, and visible when done poorly. Double exposures left telltale signs. Cut and paste composites showed seams, inconsistencies in grain. This image showed none of those markers. The grain pattern remained uniform across the frame, uninterrupted, even through the darkest area. Whatever appeared there had been present at the moment of exposure, recorded honestly by the film without distinction. That realization marked a turning point. If the irregularity was not a flaw introduced after the fact, then it had existed in front of the camera. It had occupied space, interrupted light, influenced shadow. And yet it was not something the photographer had framed intentionally. The composition suggested no awareness of anything unusual. The girl was centered, the dog balanced beside her, the background neatly arranged. There was no attempt to hide or emphasize the anomaly. It simply existed, partially concealed by the animal's body, as though positioning itself where it could be present without drawing immediate attention. Speculation grew quieter, more cautious. Words were chosen carefully now. No one wanted to be the first to articulate what the shape most closely resembled, because to do so would make it harder to dismiss. Still, the mind returned to the same conclusion again and again. The contour suggested curvature consistent with a torso, like mass, but compressed, folded unnaturally low. There was an implication of orientation, of something angled toward the girl rather than the camera, as though its focus lay elsewhere. The dog's posture began to make a different kind of sense. Its body blocked the majority of the form, not by accident but by placement. It sat squarely between the shape and the girl, its spine straight, its weight settled heavily as if bracing. Its head turned outward, eyes fixed on the lens, alert to the observer rather than what lay behind it. The animal no longer read as a passive subject, but as a barrier, a presence positioned to interrupt a line of sight. Every attempt to rationalize the anomaly collapsed under the same resistance. It did not behave like shadow, artifact, damage, or error. It behaved like something obeying its own rules, rules that overlapped with the physical world just enough to be captured on film, but not enough to be explained by it. The more rigorously the image was analyzed, the more it asserted this independence, until the most unsettling possibility began to take shape not as a dramatic leap but as a quiet, unavoidable inference, that the photograph had recorded an element that should not have been there according to anatomy, optics, or time itself, and that whatever it was had not been accidental, had not wandered into the frame by chance, but had occupied that position with a precision suggesting awareness of both the child beside it and the act of being photographed, remaining partially hidden, not because it could not be seen, but because it had chosen exactly how much of itself to allow the camera to take. The search for historical context began as an attempt to anchor the photograph in something stable, a way to counter the unease with facts and documentation. Names were sought first, then locations, then any trace of the girl that might exist outside the frame. Census records from the early 1930s were consulted, cross-referenced with property maps and parish registries. The house in which the album had been found yielded a family name, and from there a network of distant relatives, most of whom had never seen the photograph before and could offer no explanation for its presence. Still, one detail persisted across multiple records: a child matching the girl's approximate age and description, listed as residing on the property in 1931. The records noted her existence clearly enough at first. Birth date, parentage, school enrollment, ordinary details that suggested an unremarkable childhood. Then, abruptly, there was a gap. School attendance ended mid-year with no explanation. Census updates listed her as present, then absent, then omitted entirely. No death certificate surfaced. No burial record. It was as though she had slipped sideways out of documentation, leaving behind only the faintest impressions of having once been accounted for. Local newspapers from the period were scanned next, their pages brittle and yellowed, their ink faded but legible. Most issues were filled with routine matters, social notices, market prices, small crimes. Then, tucked into a corner of one edition several weeks after the photograph's date, a brief article appeared. It spoke of a child who had gone missing from a rural property, last seen playing in the yard in the late afternoon. The description was sparse, cautious, the tone measured. There was no mention of panic, no suggestion of foul play, just a statement that the family requested discretion and prayers. What followed in subsequent issues was stranger than any dramatic headline might have been. There were no updates, no appeals, no reports of searches or discoveries. The story simply vanished, as if the editors had been instructed to let it die quietly. That silence felt deliberate, heavier than ink. The dog appeared again in the records, though not where expected. Veterinary logs from neighboring towns noted an animal matching its description being treated years later for minor injuries, always brought in by different individuals. The name recorded for the dog varied slightly each time, but the physical description remained consistent: large, dark-coated, unusually calm. What drew attention was the estimated age. Each record suggested the dog was in its prime, never old, never young, its age shifting just enough to fit whatever assumption the attending veterinarian made. Over a span of more than a decade, the animal did not seem to age in any measurable way. Eyewitness accounts, gathered later through letters and oral histories, added to the disquiet. Several people remembered a dog that wandered into their lives briefly, stayed for weeks or months, then disappeared. It was described as protective, almost possessive of children in particular, positioning itself between them and adults, strangers, even parents. One account mentioned the dog growling softly at nothing visible, standing rigid in empty doorways as though blocking something unseen. The property where the girl had lived changed hands multiple times after her disappearance. Each new owner reported an unease they could not fully articulate. Some spoke of sounds at night, others of shadows that did not align with light sources, of a persistent sense of being watched from low angles. None of these accounts stood out on their own. Taken together, they formed a pattern that echoed the irregularities in the photograph. Attempts were made to locate the original photographer. Studio stamps were examined, handwriting compared, But the trail ended quickly. The photograph bore no identifying marks beyond the date. No receipt, no negative. It was as if the act of taking the picture had left no trace beyond the print itself. That absence felt intentional, though no motive could be assigned to it. As these fragments accumulated, a different understanding of the image began to take shape. It was no longer seen as a snapshot of a moment, but as a fixed point around which events had arranged themselves. The disappearance of the girl no longer felt like an isolated tragedy. It felt connected to the image in a way that defied chronology, as though the photograph had not merely recorded what happened before the loss, but had played a role in what followed. The dog's continued presence long after the girl's absence sharpened that suspicion. It had outlived not only her, but nearly everyone connected to the original household. It moved through time untethered, appearing where needed, vanishing before questions could be asked. Always watching, always positioning itself as a boundary. The photograph was examined again with this new context in mind, and details that once seemed abstract gained narrative weight. The girl's hand on the dog's head now read less as affection and more as reliance. The dog's placement between her and the darker shape beneath it felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. The image began to resemble not a family keepsake, but a record of containment, a moment in which something dangerous had been held at bay, just long enough to be captured on film. The most unsettling realization came not from any single document or account, but from their collective implication. Whatever had taken the girl had not done so violently or suddenly. There were no reports of struggle, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a body. It was as though she had simply gone where the records could not follow. And the photograph, once thought to preserve innocence, now seemed to mark the last point at which she existed fully within the world that could still name her, the dog beside her, not as a pet, but as a sentinel, maintaining a fragile boundary whose eventual failure had erased her from everything except memory and silvered paper, leaving behind a trail of absences that pointed back again and again to that single image and the thing it partially concealed, waiting beneath the dog's shadow, patient enough to outlast documentation, witnesses, and time itself, lingering not as proof, but as implication, unresolved, and still exerting its quiet pull on anyone who studied the photograph long enough to feel the weight of what had been lost without ever being properly found. The final understanding did not arrive as a revelation, but as a slow, suffocating convergence of everything that had already been uncovered. By the time the photograph was studied again, it no longer felt like an object that could be examined safely. There was a sense that it was no longer passive, that it had shifted roles from evidence to participant. The more time spent with it, the stronger the impression grew that the image was not merely preserving a moment from the past, but continuing it, holding something in suspension rather than letting it end. Attention returned to the idea that the photograph might not have captured an event, but a presence. The irregularity beneath the dog was no longer treated as an anomaly to be identified, but as something deliberately framed. When the composition was analyzed with that assumption, the balance of the image changed. The girl stood just close enough to the dog to remain within its reach. The dog sat just far enough forward to obscure what lay behind it. The camera's angle, slightly lower than eye level, suggested the photographer had been positioned deliberately, perhaps guided without realizing it, to see only what was permitted. What unsettled those studying the image most was the growing certainty that the photograph was not meant to warn. It was not a message, not a confession, not even a mistake. It functioned more like a seal, The dark form beneath the dog did not appear trapped in the image in the way a subject is trapped by exposure. Instead, it seemed anchored, fixed at a threshold, neither fully within the world of the photograph, nor fully outside it. The dog's presence began to read, as an act of containment rather than protection, a living boundary holding something in place long enough for the shutter to close. The girl's disappearance took on a new significance under this interpretation. She was no longer seen as a victim taken by an external force, but as someone who had been part of the balance the image represented. Her proximity to the dog, her stillness, her unnaturally composed expression, all suggested participation rather than accident. It became possible, even likely, that the photograph had been taken at the exact moment when the boundary was strongest, when all elements were aligned to hold whatever lay beneath the shadow at bay. Over time, that balance failed. The girl vanished, and the photograph remained. That alone implied an exchange. The idea that the image had preserved something at the cost of something else began to feel unavoidable. The dog's continued existence, unaging and transient, supported this conclusion. It had not stayed behind out of loyalty, but because its role had not ended. It moved when needed, appeared where the boundary weakened, always between children and unseen spaces, always watching. The most disturbing implication was that the photograph did not merely show what had been, but what continued to be. The dark shape did not grow clearer because of better tools or sharper resolution. It grew clearer because attention was being given to it. Each adjustment, each examination, felt less like analysis and more like invitation. The image seemed to respond not by changing, but by allowing perception to catch up to what had always been there. This led to a final, deeply unsettling hypothesis. The photograph was not static. It was a fixed point of observation, a place where something could be watched without fully entering the present. The dark presence beneath the dog was not trapped in the past. It was anchored to the act of being seen. As long as the photograph remained unnoticed, unexamined beyond its surface, the boundary held. But once magnified, studied, and shared, that boundary thinned. Those who spent the most time with the image began to report subtle experiences they struggled to articulate. A sense of pressure when viewing it, a feeling of being observed from below eye level, dreams in which they stood in a sunlit yard, unable to move, while something waited just behind a familiar shape. These accounts were never identical, but they shared a common thread of proximity, of something held just out of sight by a presence that could not last forever. The photograph's charm was now understood as a necessary component of its function. Innocence was not incidental, it was camouflage. The image needed to invite attention without provoking fear, to be passed along, admired, preserved. In doing so, it ensured its own survival, carrying the boundary forward through time. Each new viewer unknowingly reinforced its relevance, simply by acknowledging it, by accepting its surface meaning before looking closer. The final realization settled not as a conclusion, but as a weight. The photograph did not capture a moment when something went wrong. It captured a moment when something was still being held back. The dog's gaze, steady and unblinking, was not directed at the photographer, but at anyone who would one day look at the image closely enough to see past its charm. It was not warning them away. It was measuring them, assessing whether they would notice the boundary at all, or whether their attention would be enough to weaken it. In that understanding, the photograph became less an artifact of loss and more an ongoing negotiation. The girl was gone, the dog continued, and the presence beneath the shadow remained exactly where it had always been, neither advancing nor retreating, waiting not for time to pass but for attention to accumulate, for eyes to linger, for curiosity to override caution, because the image did not need to move or change to fulfill its purpose. It only needed to be seen deeply enough for the boundary it represented to become visible and fragile, and eventually unable to hold, at which point the photograph would no longer be a record of what once was but the last quiet frame before something stepped fully out of the shadow and into the space where observation ends and participation begins.